Book Talk begins at 11 minutes and 35 seconds. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 658, Huswifs. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by our lovely patrons at patreon.com/CraftLit and our channel members over at YouTube on our channel, CraftLit-channel. This week, we would like to highlight Nancy Halliday, Jantao Yang, Allison Jennings Roche, Cindy Barrick, Diana Jablonski, and a new patron, Julie Thompson. Thank you so much for your support. We could not do this without you. And another wonderful supporter of our show, Amy, who has generously donated our items for our raffle for this month. We have the Jane Austen bag that has the quote from Emma and the What Would Jane Do mug, and they're adorable. We have links over to those items on Amy's store so that you can take a look at them, and that's in the show notes or down below. And we also just have a regular link to her store as well. And if you haven't gone to look, you really should. She makes things, she designs wonderful things for the craft literati, bags and mugs for book lovers, for teachers, for library lovers, for empty nesters. And she's a really good designer. They're all super cute and she's great. It's definitely worth a look. And her Etsy store this is all one word, Janice Design Studio. That's JANEECE Design Studio. And if you use the Etsy app or the Etsy on your browser, you can search for stores directly. If you try and type that studio name into the search bar without indicating that it's a store, it will just come back and go, what? I don't know what you're talking about. So go and take a look, or you can do the easiest thing and follow the link in the show notes, and that will get you where you need to go. Well, hello, how are you? I'm here, and I'm just going to leave it at that. It's been really hard not having narcolepsy meds. It's been 10 years since I had to live like this, and I'm really tired. But be that as it may, that does not detract from the fact that we have now, because Eric is awesome, 3 Men in a Boat up on the YouTube membership channel. This is already available on Patreon for anybody at the $5 level and above. Same thing on the app. If you have the premium subscription on the app, you have access to 3 Men in a Boat. But the YouTube membership people didn't until now. Eric's going through the back catalog and he is gradually uploading everything, which is heroic. And we thought it would be good to have something funny, actually, really funny. I mean, Jane Austen is fun, but 3 Men in a Boat will make you spit milk out of your nose if you're drinking milk while you're listening. It's that kind of book. So the only thing I have of mine to share with you today, along with things just being very difficult, like I'm recording this on a Monday, and this is going to be my brain for the rest of the week. I will not have any brain left, not a functioning brain. It'll be a headachy brain, and it'll be an annoying brain, and it'll be a brain that doesn't remember anything aside from keeping my heart beating and my lungs breathing. I don't think it's doing much. But because of that, I've been doing more of the slow stitching like we've talked about. And Andrew did a really sweet thing for me. We tried to go out for breakfast a couple of weeks ago, which, meant I crashed for a couple of days. But he got me this little pewter medallion that says, refuse to sink. And it's, just a little inch wide, half an inch tall. It's just like a little worry stone to put in your pocket and remember, refuse to sink. I like it. And Andrew knows I love the Ocean show. So I had this in my pocket, and then I was slow stitching something else. And I thought, I seem to recall people talking about prayer pockets. And so I started to look into whether there were particular patterns for prayer pockets or anything like that, where you would put a medallion, a metal saint's icon, whatever, into a little pockety thing. And there are definitely patterns on the web. They are definitely Christian, which is not a problem. It's just I'm Jewish. And they're very specific about, like, you sew the cross in, a little cross medallion into the prayer pocket this way, and all of that. And I thought, well, obviously I live in America. Most of the people listening are Christian, but I also know that because CraftLit listeners are just awesome, we have a very broad spectrum of listeners. And so I thought, maybe not a prayer pocket, maybe a peace pocket, or a peace of mind peace pocket. So PEACE, peace pocket, and then a piece of mindfulness stitching. And so I just started stitching to try and figure out if there was a way to create a small pocket that was kind of uniform in size and that was substantial enough to keep the medallion in. So I did an envelope back, like you would on a pillow. An envelope backed pillow is the kind where you can slide the pillow in and have the two edges fold over each other. I don't think that made any sense at all. If you've ever put a pillow inside a pillowcase that doesn't have, like a throw pillow that doesn't have a zipper on it, you've used an envelope back pillow cover. So I did. So I stitched, I was just stitching along. And if you're looking on YouTube, you will see these right now because I'm going to be holding them up. There will be pictures of them on the show notes if you want to see. There's the little pocket. And that's the envelope. So the medallion can slide all the way up here or all the way down there, but it's not going to come out. And then I thought, well, I did swirly things. I'm not very good at doing circles. So I'm really working on doing circly things. And then I thought, oh, I should just do something completely different on the back. So I did. And this one, I took the idea, these are all 3 to 3.5 inches. The quilt block would be the one that's being used for the color wash quilts that the last Homely House Kate did one a while ago, I think, but they're all over the web and people do beautiful things with them. But I also took the idea from log cabin quilts that you start with a red something in the middle, which is the heart of your home, the hearth of your home, the warm red fire that keeps everything together and everybody happy and warm. I took that idea on this side and then just did stitches, seed stitches, some cross stitch, and something I have really never done very well, but I'm really proud of, a vine with flowers on it. And then I blanket stitched the edges together, and I have my little piece pocket that I've been carrying with me. So I started thinking, that was fun. As I'm doing this, I'm listening to books. Often it's Emma. Sometimes it's Emma Plus. So I've started keeping track of what I am listening to while I mindfully stitch. Kind of find that Zen place where it's okay that I don't have a brain. And so I showed the people on the Thursday night Zoom call. They're like, yeah, make more and put these on Etsy. So I think I am. I put the other yo-yo quilt wall hanging up on Etsy a couple weeks ago when I brought it up. And I'm going to put these on Etsy too. And then they're going to be completely random. I'm not ever going to be somebody who has an Etsy store that is like the Floppy Links guy who does the steel fidget toys. That's what he does. That's what you go to his shop for. You are going to find the most amazing fidget toys. I will give you a link to him if you don't remember before. He's just lovely. Aaron worked with his girlfriend during the pandemic when Aaron was being a tour guide up at the cave. So that's why I know the Floppy Links guy. But I'm not ever going to be somebody like that. You guys know me. I rotate crafts. So I'm going to put up whatever I'm working on that is mindful. So if you believe that items that are made with care and with love and with mindfulness carry some of that love and care and mindfulness with them, then this is that kind of thing, because that's all I've got right now. So here's another one. This one, all the stitches are completely different. I just go where the spirit moves me. This one on this side looks almost like an underwater scene. I don't know where that came from, but it just kind of does. And then I did one more that's complete. I just really, really liked the floral stitching on that. And then I thought, you know what? I talked about on each of these, one side has a pocket for a medallion or something. And I will get more of these medallions and I'll give people some choices, I think, about which medallion you get inside your pocket. But it will not come medallion less. It will come with a little pewter doohickey. But then I thought, well, I've been putting the red heart on these other ones. Maybe I should just see if I could do a really tiny log cabin. And so I did. So I've got that on one side and then that on the other. Yeah. So people who are listening on the podcast, you can look and see these in the show notes. And yeah, I'm really happy. It's actually the happiest thing that's happened to me in a while. I'm really enjoying these. So who knows? Who knows how long that will go on for, but it's keeping me out of trouble and not breaking my brain. Two good things. So our chapters this week, we are now in volume 2. We're doing volume 2, chapter 1, 2, and 3, or chapter 19, 20, and 21. And the chapters that we are about to do are usually done in the movie versions, but 2 of the chapters more often get kind of smashed together as one event when really it's not in the book. We get a lot more information, detailed background information on characterization here in the book. So that's going to be kind of awesome. Things to know. We know about drawing rooms are really with drawing rooms, but in this case, they're talking about the drawing room floor. So like when I used to live in Brooklyn, there were 4 apartments in our brownstone, and the layout on each floor was slightly different, even though we all had basically the same width and length. How the rooms had been broken up was different. And the first floor, which means you go up the steps, the Sesame Street steps, and in the door, the apartment on that floor would have been considered the drawing room floor. It was not the ground floor. It was not up high. It was the main floor where you would have guests. And because of that, they had extra high ceilings and they had a much different front room structure, because back in the day when this would have been all one home, that was the way it was set out. So a drawing room floor would have just been the floor that actually has the most space for that part of the building, but that doesn't mean it's big. It just means that you probably have 2 rooms instead of 1. You're going to hear something, and depending on who's reading the book, they might pronounce this funny, buffet, instead of the way it's usually spelled, at least nowadays, Buffet. It's Beaufet. Means the same thing. But just in case it gets pronounced funny in the version of Emma that you're listening to, I wanted to give you a heads up. If you think back to Northanger Abbey, you may recall the Master of Ceremonies ball. Master of Ceremonies being the dude who was in charge of Bath for the season. If I'm remembering correctly, and this just came to my mind, so I did not look this up, I think the actual real life Master of Ceremonies was the same guy for like 15 years running or something. And the book that he had everybody sign when you came into Bath, I think they still have some of those preserved in the museum as well. But you're going to hear a reference to the Master of Ceremonies ball. And it is, if your brain goes, wait, that was Northanger Abbey, you are correct. Okay, so I have to be honest with you. The first chapter today is Miss Bates. It's the first time that we're really going to hear, and I mean hear, Miss Bates. And I know she's supposed to be annoying, but you learn so much from her in such a short period of time. And I have tried reading her lines out loud. They are so hard to do right. And it's been very interesting because I've been listening to both Jenny Agutter and Juliet Stevenson, and they are very, very different readers. Both of them did an amazing job with Myth Spates, but they did a different job. They're not cookie cutters. They're not exactly the same. So there's a lot of flexibility in there, but it's kind of like Shakespeare. Like David Tennant can make Shakespeare sound like normal people talking talkity talk. I can't. It's kind of the same thing with Miss Bates. If it's really well read, I don't find her annoying at all. I really don't. I probably would in real life if I had to sit there. But if I could sit there with knitting, I would be fine because she's just so entertaining. So try to listen to her as I live in a world with no television and no radio and no internet. Here's my entertainment. Try and think of her that way. She is the life that you bring to the party to keep the conversation going. There will never be an awkward silence when Miss Bates is around. And if there is, something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. She is the reason that this episode is called Huswif, because there are Huswifs that are pronounced Huswif. There are Huswifs that are housewives that look like they're spelled Huswif. There are all sorts of different ones, but it all comes down to a little kit, a little sewing kit that a woman could carry with them, or a soldier could carry with him, because there were a lot from World War I, especially, and some from World War II as well. But it was a little padded sewing kit. And I have, if you're watching on YouTube, you will see on the screen. And if you're listening on the app or anywhere else, you will have a link to this video available for you in the show notes. But this is my Huswif that I made. I did this 2 or 3 years ago because I was trying to find a way. I was getting really annoyed with quilting because you can only cut off a length, so many inches of quilting thread to use before it gets tangled. So what is it? A triumph of hope over knowledge. You keep cutting off longer lengths than you should, and then it gets tangled and you get annoyed. So I thought, well, the problem is threading the bloody things. If I could just have a whole mess load of needles threaded and ready to go, that would be easy. But those were getting tangled too, and it was really driving me crazy. And then I thought, wait a minute, what if you thread all the needles all at once onto the spool? And then you just take the first needle in the lineup of needles that are threaded, and you take that out of the little package and you pull that with the thread out, leaving the other needles still threaded and waiting for you attached in the Huswif. And that is what I did. So it's like a never-ending threaded needle. I've been really, really happy with this thing. It has made my life so much easier. My eyes are not what they used to be. It is much easier for me to just sit there with the magnifying glass and thread a dumpster load of needles. And then they're all on deck, and they're all, it's like a needle case with thread. And it is, in fact, very close to what some of the Huswifs or housewives were back in the day. So you're going to hear that referred to a couple times. You're also going to hear knitting referred to, which made me very happy. And you're going to hear about letters being crossed, or crossed half, or fully crossed, or checkered. This is the technique of saving paper that pretty much everybody employed. They're using thicker paper so it didn't bleed through, the ink didn't bleed through to the other side. The ink is also fairly strong in general. So if you had non-bloppy penmanship, if you were able to write with a quill pen without having it blob ink all over the place, and the people whose letters we still have are those people, they were able to write legibly. You'd write in one direction, and then you'd turn the paper and write the other direction crosswise. So the words are crossing over each other. And there's a picture in the show notes and a picture on the screen right now showing you what this looks like if you get a chance to look. It's amazing. People crossed multiple times. Like you could have straight across, you could have up and down, and then you could have diagonals. So it really became insane. And then you just left a portion of the paper blank, 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 so you could fold the whole thing up, hiding all of the written letter parts inside, and then stick your sealing wax or your little medallion thing, sticking that on, and then you're done. And I did find actually a website, which we're linking out to for you, a website on how all of this worked. The website that I found is more like a clearinghouse. So she links out to all the other people who explain the paper, explain the inks, explain all this stuff. So you can, it's like one-stop shopping. You can learn a lot about how they wrote letters back then, which, if you're interested, is kind of cool. So yeah, there's that rabbit hole you can go down. You're going to hear a reference to a family sending someone the whole way in their carriage. And if you think back to Jane Eyre, which, by the way, I just went and looked up, was episode 274, and that was in 2012. That was a long time ago. But in Jane Eyre and in Northanger Abbey as well, which started with episode 546, which was only 2021, you may recall that there are plot points that deal with women taking carriage rides alone, either carriages for hire or family carriages. And the distinction between the two is very clearly made in those books. It is not cheap to own a horse, own a carriage, run them. And if you send somebody away in your carriage, it still has to come back to you. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of money. And you're, paying for the labor and the feed and the putting people up. It's a lot. You're going to hear Miss Bates stop herself. She's talking about people visiting Ireland, and she said, this is interesting because she catches herself. It's very strange to be in different kingdoms, comma, I was going to say, comma, but however, different countries, comma, and then she goes on with it. She stops herself. I was going to say kingdoms, but now I remember in 1801, New Year's Day, 1801, the Act of Union went through and Ireland became part of the UK. Now we have a UK. So it's at this point, Scotland came in 1707, Ireland in 1801, which, as we know, was not easy and smooth. But yes, that's why you will hear Miss Bates correct herself, is it was recently done, and it makes sense that she would stumble on that, especially because she goes so bloody fast. Track, as you're listening, track Emma's thinking response to stories of Mr. Dixon, because I want to come back to that when we talk at the end. So just keep your ear open. You're going to hear about Weymouth again. And I think last week I said Weymouth, and it's not, it's Weymouth. I listened, I got corrected on YouTube, which I actually really appreciated. The commenter was very kind. But I also went and listened twice to Jenny Agutter and Juliet Stevenson. And so I wrote out phonetically Weymouth. So now we say it right. And last week I said Mr. Darcy when I meant Mr. Knightley at one point. And I just, you can tell where my brain is. Not here. You're going to hear about somebody on a little boat. I think we've heard the story already that Jane Fairfax slipped and she was going to fall. And then Mr. Dixon caught her habit, which sounds like she's not a nun, right? And this is just what women's clothing could sometimes can be called, especially if it was kind of not super nice clothes that you were going to go to church in or go to a ball in. It was just habitual clothes. It was just your day-to-day clothes. It would make sense to call it a habit. Another thing to track while we're listening is listen for the references about Jane Fairfax's health. We're going to come back to that at the end as well. I didn't track this when I read this the first time 30 some odd years ago. And it's interesting going through it now again and seeing all of the references. So just kind of keep that antenna up. So the first chapter we listened to today is the Miss Bates chapter. The second chapter we listened to today is the Jane Fairfax chapter. So you may remember we had a chapter a little while ago that was Frank Churchill did not come. Those were the opening words of the next chapter. This one, Jane Fairfax was an orphan. And it's very interesting because Jane Austen does this a lot, and I hadn't noticed it before, but it's almost like giving you a chapter title. Or a thesis statement at the beginning of chapters. Like, and this is what I'm going to talk about in this chapter now. Here we go. And that is correct. So this one is about Jane Fairfax. We finally get her backstory. We got Frank's. Now we're getting Jane's. You're going to hear the word fondling, Fondling. I'm used to hearing foundling, two completely different things. Fondling is a favorite, something you are very fond of, or a person you are very fond of is a fondling. Foundling is a kid or an infant who's been found, like an orphan, which is why I got confused here at first, thinking she's an orphan, but she wasn't a foundling. Everybody knew who her parents were and all that. And that is correct, Heather. It was not the word foundling. Camp fever, probably typhus. Lousy way to go. Not that there are great ways to go, but I mean, aside from in your bed, quietly, surrounded by family and friends. You're going to hear lots and lots of references to what a governess's life was like. They are all accurate. They're probably not even nearly as bad as it really was. I know we have a lot of listeners who read Agnes Grey, which is still on my bedside table. I will get to it at some point. But yeah, I think Agnes Grey is pretty universally identified as the most accurate picture of what it was like to be a governess at this time, where you're better educated often than the people who are employing you, but you are not part of the family with the adults or with the children. It's a horrible, horrible situation. You're going to hear about Colonel Campbell. The line is his income by pay and appointments. So the income he was making, the money he was actually making by being a colonel, was handsome. It was a lot. But his fortune was moderate. And I know we talked about this way back in Pride and Prejudice and Mr. Darcy, that you have the principal amount of money and then the amount of money that you get, like living off the interest from that principal. So you never want to touch the principal. You want to only use the interest that you're making off of it. And so Colonel Campbell had a lot of liquid assets, but he didn't have a substantial nest egg to call his own, like his fortune. He has 10,000 a year, 12,000 a year, whatever. Jane Austen uses a phrase that I don't remember seeing before to describe women's, I don't say women's work. Well, she calls it a lighter talent, Lighther, lighter as in exactly what you think it is. It's the chick stuff, so it can't be heavy. It's got to be light. It's just female accomplishments, playing the piano, drawing, painting, that kind of thing. Female accomplishments at the time. Cavil, Cavil. To cavil is to kind of argue, to quibble, just to be kind of nitpicky about something. And our third chapter today, we've had our introduction to Miss Bates. We've had our introduction to Jane Fairfax. Now we're going to have the chapter where Emma and Jane actually interact. Plus, there's also going to be news that arrives brought to you by Miss Bates. So it's going to be fun to listen to. At the beginning of this chapter, Mr. Knightley talks about Emma letting Jane Fairfax use her piano as a real indulgence, which means a real favor to her. Jane doesn't have a piano at Miss Bates. They have a tiny little place. So this would have been an indulgence for Jane, not the other way around. It's just a way of saying it was a really nice thing you did for her. You're going to hear Mr. Woodhouse referring to a muffin. And of course, all I can think of are giant blueberry muffins like you get in the States these days. He's talking about something that's more like a crumpet. It would have been buttered, but not a muffin the way that we think of, or at least in the States that we think of muffins today. Not sweet like that at all. Diffidence. Diffidence is somebody's being diffident if they're being modest or they're kind of shy or retired, and it's caused because they have a a lack of self-confidence. Their diffidence is not because they don't like you or because they don't want to be part of the conversation. It's because they have no self-confidence, and so they keep pulling back. There's going to be some awesome food humor going on in today's chapter, and a reference. I think it's the first time we get an actual reference to the name of the cook for Mr. Woodhouse. It's Searle, Serle. You will hear him named and talked about from this point on. He pops up all over the place, but that is his name. The cook is Searle. Spencer, Spencer. We have a picture for you in the show notes and on screen if you're watching on YouTube. It is the little coat that has the same cut as the Empire waist dresses have, but it's usually, not always, usually long sleeved, but cut the same way so it doesn't go all the way down to your waist. They're really cute, honestly. I think they're just adorable. You will hear Miss Bates say, "My mother desires her very best compliments and regards and 1,000 thanks, and says you really quite oppress her." This doesn't mean oppression the way we think of it. It's you're overwhelming her. It's so much. It's just so much. Thank you. So it's a nice thing. They're going to be referring to the vicarage pew that Mrs. Bates, elderly Mrs. Bates, who used to be the wife of the vicar, now she's the widow. The vicarage pew would have been the first row where the vicar's family would sit. And Mr. Elton doesn't have a family, so he's been having Mrs. and Miss Bates sit in the vicarage pew because she does not, this is in quotation marks, she does not hear quite quick, which doesn't necessarily mean quick. It means like accurate at the moment. There's a delay in her ability to hear things clearly. So I think she has some interesting selective hearing going on, old Mrs. Bates. But either way, it's gotten her moved up into the vicarage pew, which is very, very kind of Mr. Elton. You will hear a reference to a haberdashers. I know we've come up with haberdashery off and on, but they are shops. A lot of times it was kind of the meeting place where women would find each other because you're there to get fabric or dry goods, things to make. If you were going to trim a bonnet, if you were going to make a pinafore, this is where you could get your fabric, et cetera, et cetera. It's the haberdashery. And that's it. All right. You are now very, very well armed to get all the things that are going on in chapters 19, 20, and 21, or volume 2, chapter 1, 2, and 3. If you are listening to a different version of Emma, you can fast wind to 1 hour, 24 minutes, and 36 seconds. All right, here we go.
Volume 2, Chapter 1. Emma and Harriet had been walking together one morning, and in Emma's opinion had been talking enough of Mr. Elton for that day. She could not think that Harriet's solace or her own sins required more, and she was therefore industriously getting rid of the subject as they returned. But it burst out again when she thought she had succeeded, and after speaking some time of what the poor must suffer in winter, and receiving no other answer than a very plaintive "Mr. Elton is so good to the poor," she found something else must be done. They were just approaching the house where lived Mrs. and Miss Bates. She determined to call upon them and seek safety in numbers. There was always sufficient reason for such an attention. Mrs. and Miss Bates loved to be called on, and she knew she was considered by the very few who presumed ever to see imperfection in her as rather negligent in that respect, and as not contributing what she ought to the stock of their scanty comforts. She had had many a hint from Mr. Knightley, and some from her own heart, as to her deficiency, but none were equal to counteract the persuasion of its being very disagreeable, a waste of time, tiresome women, and all the horror of being in danger of falling in with the second-rate and third-rate of Highbury, who were calling on them for ever, and therefore she seldom went near them. But now she made the sudden resolution of not passing their door without going in, observing, as she proposed it to Harriet, that as well as she could calculate, they were just now quite safe from any letter from Jane Fairfax. The house belonged to people in business. Mrs. and Miss Bates occupied the drawing-room floor. and there, in the very moderate-sized apartment which was everything to them, the visitors were most cordially and even gratefully welcomed. The quiet, neat old lady, who with her knitting was seated in the warmest corner, wanting even to give up her place to Miss Woodhouse, and her more active, talking daughter, almost ready to overpower them with care and kindness, thanks for their visit, solicitude for their shoes, anxious inquiries after Mr. Woodhouse's health, cheerful communications about her mother's, and sweet cake from the buffet. Mrs. Cole had just been there, just called in for 10 minutes, and had been so good as to sit an hour with them, and she had taken a piece of cake and been so kind as to say she liked it very much, and therefore she hoped Miss Woodhouse and Miss Smith would do them the favour to eat a piece too. The mention of the Coles was sure to be followed by that of Mr. Elton. There was intimacy between them, and Mr. Cole had heard from Mr. Elton since his going away. Emma knew what was coming. They must have the letter over again, and settle how long he had been gone, and how much he was engaged in company, and what a favourite he was wherever he went, and how full the master of the ceremonies ball had been. And she went through it very well, with all the interest and all the commendation that could be requisite, and always putting forward to prevent Harriet's being obliged to say a word. This she had been prepared for when she entered the house, but meant, having once talked him handsomely over, to be no farther incommoded by any troublesome topic, and to wander at large amongst all the mistresses and misses of Highbury and their card-parties. She had not been prepared to have Jane Fairfax succeed Mr. Elton, but he was actually hurried off by Miss Bates. She jumped away from him at last abruptly to the Coles, to usher in a letter from her niece. "Oh, yes, Mr. Elton, I understand, certainly, as to dancing. Mrs. Cole was telling me that dancing in the rooms at Bath was— Mrs. Cole was so kind as to sit some time with us, talking of Jane, for as soon as she came in she began inquiring after her. Jane is so very great a favourite there. Whenever she is with us, Mrs. Cole does not know how to shew her kindness enough, and I must say that Jane deserves it as much as anybody can. And so she began inquiring after her directly, saying, 'I know you cannot have heard from Jane lately, because it is not her time for writing.' And when I immediately said, 'But indeed we have. We had a letter this very morning,' I do not know that ever I saw anybody more surprised. 'Have you, upon your honour?' said she. 'Well, that is quite unexpected. Do let me hear what she says.' Emma's politeness was at hand directly, to say with smiling interest, 'Have you heard from Miss Fairfax so lately? I am extremely happy. I hope she is well?' 'Thank you. You are so kind,' replied the happily deceived aunt, while eagerly hunting for the letter. 'Oh, here it is. I was sure it could not be far off. But I had put my huswife upon it, you see, without being aware, and so it was quite hid, but I had it in my hand so very lately that I was almost sure it must be on the table. I was reading it to Mrs. Cole, and since she went away, I was reading it again to my mother, for it is such a pleasure to her. A letter from Jane, that she can never hear it often enough, so I knew it could not be far off. And here it is, only just under my huswife, and since you are so kind as to wish to hear what she says— But first of all I really must, in justice to Jane, apologize for her writing so short a letter. Only 2 pages, you see, hardly 2, and in general she fills the whole paper and crosses half. My mother often wonders that I can make it out so well. She often says, when the letter is first opened, 'Well, Hetty, now I think you will be put to it to make out all that checker work. Don't you, ma'am?' And then I tell her I am sure she would contrive to make it out herself if she had nobody to do it for her, every word of it. I am sure she would pore over it till she had made out every word. And indeed, though my mother's eyes are not so good as they were, she can see amazingly well still, thank God, with the help of spectacles. It is such a blessing. My mother's are really very good indeed. Jane often says, when she is here, 'I am sure, grandmamma, you must have had very strong eyes to see as well as you do, and so much fine work as you have done too. I only wish my eyes may last me as well.' All this spoken extremely fast obliged Miss Bates to stop for breath, and Emma said something very civil about the excellence of Miss Fairfax's handwriting. "You are extremely kind," replied Miss Bates, highly gratified. "You, who are such a judge, and write so beautifully yourself. I am sure there is nobody's praise that could give us so much pleasure as Miss Woodhouse's. My mother does not hear. She is a little deaf, you know. Ma'am," addressing her, Do you hear what Miss Woodhouse is so obliging to say about Jane's handwriting?" And Emma had the advantage of hearing her own silly compliment repeated twice over before the good old lady could comprehend it. She was pondering in the meanwhile upon the possibility, without seeming very rude, of making her escape from Jane Fairfax's letter, and had almost resolved on hurrying away directly under some slight excuse, when Miss Bates turned to her again and seized her attention. "My mother's deafness is very trifling, you see, just nothing at all. By only raising my voice and saying anything 2 or 3 times over, she is sure to hear, but then she is used to my voice. But it is very remarkable that she should always hear Jane better than she does me. Jane speaks so distinct. However, she will not find her grandmamma at all deafer than she was 2 years ago, which is saying a great deal at my mother's time of life. And it really is full 2 years, you know, since she was here. We never were so long without seeing her before, and as I was telling Mrs. Cole, we shall hardly know how to make enough of her now." "Are you expecting Miss Fairfax here soon?" "Oh, yes, next week." "Indeed, that must be a very great pleasure." "Thank you. You are very kind. Yes, next week. Everybody is so surprised, and everybody says the same obliging things. I am sure she will be as happy to see her friends at Highbury as they can be to see her. Yes, Friday or Saturday. She cannot say which, because Colonel Campbell will be wanting the carriage himself one of those days. So very good of them to send her the whole way. But they always do, you know. Oh, yes, Friday or Saturday next. That is what she writes about. That's the reason of her writing out a rule, as we call it. For in the common course we should not have heard from her before next Tuesday or Wednesday." "Yes, so I imagined. I was afraid there could be little chance of my hearing anything of Miss Fairfax to-day." "So obliging of you. No, we should not have heard it if not been for this particular circumstance of her being to come here so soon. My mother is so delighted, for she is to be 3 months with us at least. 3 months, she says so, positively, as I am going to have the pleasure of reading to you. The case is, you see, that the Campbells are going to Ireland. Mrs. Dixon has persuaded her father and mother to come over and see her directly. They had not intended to go over till the summer, but she is so impatient to see them again, for till she married last October she was never away from them so much as a week, which must make it very strange to be in different kingdoms, I was going to say, but however different countries, and so she wrote a very urgent letter to her mother, or her father, I declare I do not know which it was, but we shall see presently in Jane's letter, wrote in Mr. Dixon's name as well as her own, to press their coming over directly, and they would give them the meeting in Dublin, and take them back to their country seat, Ballycraig, a beautiful place, I fancy. Jane has heard a great deal of its beauty, from Mr. Dixon, I mean. I do not know that she ever heard about it from anybody else, but it was very natural, you know, that he should like to speak of his own place while he was paying his addresses, and as Jane used to be very often walking out with them, for Colonel and Mrs. Campbell were very particular about their daughters not walking out often with only Mr. Dixon, for which I do not at all blame them. Of course she heard everything he might be telling Miss Campbell about his own home in Ireland, and I think she wrote us word that he had shown them some drawings of the place, views that he had taken himself. He is a most amiable, charming young man, I believe. Jane was quite longing to go to Ireland from his account of things." At this moment, an ingenious and animating suspicion entering Emma's brain with regard to Jane Fairfax, this charming Mr. Dixon, and the not going to Ireland, she said, with the insidious design of farther discovery, "You must feel it very fortunate that Miss Fairfax should be allowed to come to you at such a time. Considering the very particular friendship between her and Mrs. Dixon, you could hardly have expected her to be excused from accompanying Colonel and Mrs. Campbell." Very true indeed. The very thing that we have always been rather afraid of, for we should not have liked to have her at such distance from us, for months together, not able to come if anything was to happen. But you see, everything turns out for the best. They want her, Mr. and Mrs. Dixon, excessively to come over with Colonel and Mrs. Campbell. Quite depend upon it. Nothing can be more kind or pressing than their joint invitation, Jane says, as you will hear presently. Mr. Dixon does not seem in the least backward in any attention. He is a most charming young man. Ever since the service he rendered Jane at Weymouth, when they were out in that party on the water, and she, by the sudden whirling round of something or other among the sails, would have been dashed into the sea at once, and actually was all but gone, if he had not, with the greatest presence of mind, caught hold of her habit. I can never think of it without trembling. But ever since we had the history of that day, I have been so fond of Mr. Dixon." But in spite of her friend's urgency, and her own wish of seeing Ireland, Miss Fairfax prefers devoting the time to you and Mrs. Bates. Yes, entirely her own doing, entirely her own choice, and Colonel and Mrs. Campbell think she does quite right, just what they should recommend, and indeed they particularly wish her to try her native air, as she has not been quite so well as usual lately. I am concerned to hear of it. I think they judge wisely, but Mrs. Dixon must be very much disappointed. Mrs. Dixon, I understand, has no remarkable degree of personal beauty, is not by any means to be compared with Miss Fairfax? Oh, no, you are very obliging to say such things, but certainly not. There is no comparison between them. Miss Campbell always was absolutely plain, but extremely elegant and amiable. Yes, that of course. Jane caught a bad cold, poor thing, so long ago as the 7th of November, as I am going to read to you, and has never been well since. A long time, is it not, for a cold to hang upon her? She never mentioned it before, because she would not alarm us. Just like her, so considerate. But, however, she is so far from well that her kind friends the Campbells think she had better come home, and try an air that always agrees with her, and they have no doubt that 3 or 4 months at Highbury will entirely cure her, and it is certainly a great deal better that she should come here than go to Ireland, if she is unwell. Nobody could nurse her as we should do. It appears to me the most desirable arrangement in the world. And so she is to come to us next Friday or Saturday, and the Campbells leave town and their way to Holyhead the Monday following, as you will find from Jane's letter. So sudden! You may guess, dear Miss Woodhouse, what a flurry it has thrown me in, if it were not for the drawback of her illness. But I am afraid we must expect to see her grown thin and looking very poorly. I must tell you what an unlucky thing happened to me as to that. I always make a point of reading Jane's letters through to myself first, before I read them aloud to my mother, you know, for fear of there being anything in them to distress her. Jane desired me to do it, so I always do, and so I began to-day with my usual caution. But no sooner did I come to the mention of her being unwell, than I burst out quite frightened with, "Bless me, poor Jane is ill," which my mother, being on the watch, heard distinctly, and was sadly alarmed at. However, when I read on, I found it was not near so bad as I had fancied at first, and I make so light of it now to her that she does not think about it much. But I cannot imagine how I could be so off my guard. If Jane does not get well soon, we will call in Mr. Perry. The expense shall not be thought of, and though he is so liberal and so fond of Jane that I dare say he would not mean to charge anything for attendance, we could not suffer it to be so, you know. He has a wife and a family to maintain, and is not to be giving away his time. Well, now I have just given you a hint of what Jane writes about, we will turn to her letter, and I am sure she tells her own story a great deal better than I can tell it for her. I am afraid we must be running away, said Emma, glancing at Harriet and beginning to rise. My father will be expecting us. I had no intention, I thought I had no power of staying more than 5 minutes when I first entered the house. I merely called, because I would not pass the door without inquiring after Mrs. Bates. But I have been so pleasantly detained. Now, however, we must wish you and Mrs. Bates good morning. And not all that could be urged to detain her succeeded. She regained the street, happy in this that though much had been forced on her against her will, though she had in fact heard the whole substance of Jane Fairfax's letter, she had been able to escape the letter itself. End of Chapter 1. Volume 2, Chapter 2. Jane Fairfax was an orphan, the only child of Mrs. Bates's youngest daughter. The marriage of Lieutenant Fairfax of the Regiment of Infantry and Miss Jane Bates had had its day of fame and pleasure, hope and interest, but now nothing remained of it, save the melancholy remembrance of him dying in action abroad, of his widow sinking under consumption and grief soon afterwards, and this girl. By birth she belonged to Highbury, and when at 3 years old, on losing her mother, she became the property, the charge, the consolation, the fondling of her grandmother and aunt, there had seemed every probability of her being permanently fixed there, of her being taught only what very limited means could command, and growing up with no advantages of connection or improvement, to be engrafted on what nature had given her in a pleasing person, good understanding, and warm-hearted, well-meaning relations. But the compassionate feelings of a friend of her father gave a change to her destiny. This was Colonel Campbell, who had very highly regarded Fairfax as an excellent officer and most deserving young man, and farther had been indebted to him for such attentions, during a severe camp fever, as he believed had saved his life. These were claims which he did not learn to overlook, though some years passed away from the death of poor Fairfax before his own return to England put anything in his power. When he did return, he sought out the child and took notice of her. He was a married man with only one living child, a girl about Jane's age, and Jane became their guest, paying them long visits and growing a favourite with all, and before she was 9 years old, his daughter's great fondness for her, and his own wish of being a real friend, united to produce an offer from Colonel Campbell of undertaking the whole charge of her education. It was accepted, and from that period Jane had belonged to Colonel Campbell's family, and had lived with them entirely, only visiting her grandmother from time to time. The plan was that she should be brought up for educating others, the very few £100 which she inherited from her father making independence impossible. To provide for her otherwise was out of Colonel Campbell's power, for though his income, by pay and appointments, was handsome, his fortune was moderate and must be all his daughter's. But by giving her an education, he hoped to be supplying the means of respectable subsistence hereafter. Such was Jane Fairfax's history. She had fallen into good hands, known nothing but kindness from the Campbells, and been given an excellent education. Living constantly with right-minded and well-informed people, her heart and understanding had received every advantage of discipline and culture, and Colonel Campbell's residence being in London, every lighter talent had been done full justice to, by the attendance of first-rate masters. Her disposition and abilities were equally worthy of all that friendship could do, and at 18 or 19 she was, as far as such an early age can be qualified for the care of children, fully competent to the office of instruction herself, but she was too much beloved to be parted with. Neither father nor mother could promote, and the daughter could not endure it. The evil day was put off. It was easy to decide that she was still too young, and Jane remained with them, sharing, as another daughter, in all the rational pleasures of an elegant society, and a judicious mixture of home and amusement, with only the drawback of the future, the sobering suggestions of her own good understanding, to remind her that all this might soon be over. The affection of the whole family, the warm attachment of Miss Campbell in particular, was the more honourable to each party from the circumstance of Jane's decided superiority, both in beauty and acquirements. That nature had given it in feature could not be unseen by the young woman, nor could her higher powers of mind be unfelt by the parents. They continued together with unabated regard, however, till the marriage of Miss Campbell, who by that chance, that luck which so often defies anticipation in matrimonial affairs, giving attraction to what is moderate rather than to what is superior, engaged the affections of Mr. Dickson, a young man, rich and agreeable, almost as soon as they were acquainted, and was eligibly and happily settled, while Jane Fairfax had yet her bread to earn. This event had very lately taken place, too lately for anything to be yet attempted by her less fortunate friend towards entering on her path of duty, though she had now reached the age which her own judgment had fixed on for beginning. She had long resolved that 21 should be the period. With the fortitude of a devoted novitiate, she had resolved at 21 to complete the sacrifice, and retire from all the pleasures of life, of rational intercourse, equal society, peace and hope, to penance and mortification for ever. The good sense of Colonel and Mrs. Campbell could not oppose such a resolution, though their feelings did. As long as they lived, no exertions would be necessary, their home might be hers for ever, and for their own comfort they would have retained her wholly. But this would be selfishness. What must be at last had better be soon. Perhaps they began to feel it might have been kinder and wiser to have resisted the temptation of any delay, and spared her from a taste of such enjoyments of ease and leisure as must now be relinquished. Still, however, affection was glad to catch at any reasonable excuse for not hurrying on the wretched moment. She had never been quite well since the time of their daughter's marriage, and till she should have completely recovered her usual strength, they must forbid her engaging in duties, which, so far from being compatible with a weakened frame and varying spirits, seemed, under the most favourable circumstances, to require something more than human perfection of body and mind to be discharged with tolerable comfort. With regard to her not accompanying them to Ireland, her account to her aunt contained nothing but truth, though there might be some truths not told. It was her own choice to give the time of their absence to Highbury, to spend perhaps her last months of perfect liberty with those kind relations to whom she was so very dear, and the Campbells, whatever might be their motive or motives, whether single or double or treble, gave the arrangement their ready sanction, and said that they depended more on a few months spent in her native air for the recovery of her health than on anything else. Certain it was that she was to come, and that Highbury, instead of welcoming that perfect novelty which had been so long promised it, Mr. Frank Churchill, must put up for the present with Jane Fairfax, who could bring only the freshness of a 2 years' absence. Emma was sorry. To have to pay civilities to a person she did not like through 3 long months, to be always doing more than she wished and less than she ought. Why she did not like Jane Fairfax might be a difficult question to answer. Mr. Knightley had once told her it was because she saw in her the really accomplished young woman which she wanted to be thought herself; and though the accusation had been eagerly refuted at the time, there were moments of self-examination in which her conscience could not quite acquit her. But she could never get acquainted with her. She did not know how it was, but there was such coldness and reserve, such apparent indifference whether she pleased or not. And then her aunt was such an eternal talker, and she was made such a fuss with by everybody. And it had always been imagined that they were to be so intimate, because their ages were the same, everybody had supposed they must be so fond of each other. These were her reasons. She had no better. It was a dislike so little just, every imputed fault was so magnified by fancy, that she never saw Jane Fairfax the first time after any considerable absence, without feeling that she had injured her; and now, when the due visit was paid, on her arrival, after a 2 years' interval, she was particularly struck with the very appearance and manners, which for those 2 whole years she had been depreciating. Jane Fairfax was very elegant, remarkably elegant, and she had herself the highest value for elegance. Her height was pretty, just such as almost everybody would think tall, and nobody could think very tall. Her figure particularly graceful, her size a most becoming medium, between fat and thin, though a slight appearance of ill health seemed to point out the likeliest evil of the two. Emma could not but feel all this, and then her face, her features, there was more beauty in them altogether than she had remembered. It was not regular, but it was a very pleasing beauty. Her eyes, a deep grey, with dark eyelashes and eyebrows, had never been denied their praise; but the skin, which she had been used to cavil at, as wanting colour, had a clearness and delicacy which really needed no fuller bloom. It was a style of beauty of which elegance was the reigning character, and as such she must, in honour by all her principles, admire it; elegance, which, whether of person or of mind, she saw so little in Highbury. There, not to be vulgar, was distinction and merit. In short, she sat, during the first visit, looking at Jane Fairfax with twofold complacency, the sense of pleasure and the sense of rendering justice, and was determining that she would dislike her no longer. When she took in her history, indeed her situation, as well as her beauty, when she considered what all this elegance was destined to, what she was going to sink from, how she was going to live, it seemed impossible to feel anything but compassion and respect, especially if to every well-known particular entitling her to interest were added the highly probable circumstance of an attachment to Mr. Dickson, which she had so naturally started to herself. In that case, nothing could be more pitiable or more honourable than the sacrifices she had resolved on. Emma was very willing now to acquit her of having seduced Mr. Dickson's actions from his wife, or of anything mischievous which her imagination had suggested at first. If it were love, it might be simple, single, successless love on her side alone. She might have been unconsciously sucking in the sad poison, while a sharer of his conversation with her friend, and from the best, the purest of motives, might now be denying herself this visit to Ireland, and resolving to divide herself effectually from him and his connections, by soon beginning her career of laborious duty. Upon the whole, Emma left her with such softened, charitable feelings as made her look around in walking home, and lament that Highbury afforded no young man worthy of giving her independence, nobody she could wish to scheme about for her. These were charming feelings, but not lasting. Before she had committed herself by any public profession of eternal friendship for Jane Fairfax, or done more towards a recantation of past prejudices and errors, than saying to Mr. Knightley, "She certainly is handsome. She is better than handsome," Jane had spent an evening at Hartfield with her grandmother and aunt, and everything was relapsing much into its usual state. Former provocations reappeared. The aunt was as tiresome as ever, more tiresome, because anxiety for her health was now added to admiration of her powers, and they had to listen to the description of exactly how little bread and butter she ate for breakfast, and how small a slice of mutton for dinner, as well as to see exhibitions of new caps and new work-bags for her mother and herself, and Jane's offences rose again. They had music. Emma was obliged to play, and the thanks and praise which necessarily followed appeared to her an affectation of candour, an air of greatness, meaning only to show off in higher style her own very superior performance. She was, besides, which was the worst of all, so cold, so cautious. There was no getting at her real opinion. Wrapped up in a cloak of politeness, she seemed determined to hazard nothing. She was disgustingly, was suspiciously reserved. If anything could be more where all was most, she was more reserved on the subject of Weymouth and the Dixons than anything. She seemed bent on giving no real insight into Mr. Dixon's character, or her own value for his company, or opinion of the suitableness of the match. It was all general approbation and smoothness, nothing delineated or distinguished. It did her no service, however. Her caution was thrown away. Emma saw its artifice, and returned to her first surmises. There probably was something more to conceal than her own preference. Mr. Dixon, perhaps, had been very near changing one friend for the other, or been fixed only to Miss Campbell, for the sake of the future £12,000. The like reserve prevailed on other topics. She and Mr. Frank Churchill had been at Weymouth at the same time. It was known that they were a little acquainted, but not a syllable of real information could Emma procure as to what he truly was. Was he handsome? She believed he was reckoned a very fine young man. Was he agreeable? He was generally thought so. Did he appear a sensible young man of information? At a watering-place, or in a common London acquaintance, it was difficult to decide on such points. Manners were all that could be safely judged of, under a much longer knowledge than they had had yet of Mr. Churchill. She believed everybody found his manners pleasing. Emma could not forgive her. End of Chapter 2. Volume 2, Chapter 3. Emma could not forgive her, but as neither provocation nor resentment were discerned by Mr. Knightley, who had been of the party, and had seen only proper attention and pleasing behaviour on each side, he was expressing the next morning, being at Hartfield again on business with Mr. Woodhouse, his approbation of the whole, not so openly as he might have done had her father been out of the room, but speaking plain enough to be very intelligible to Emma. He had been used to think her unjust to Jane, and had now great pleasure in marking an improvement. "A very pleasant evening," he began, as soon as Mr. Woodhouse had been talked into what was necessary, told that he understood, and the papers swept away. "Particularly pleasant. You and Miss Fairfax gave us some very good music. I do not know a more luxurious state, sir, than sitting at one's ease to be entertained a whole evening by two such young women, sometimes with music and sometimes with conversation. I am sure Miss Fairfax must have found the evening pleasant, Emma. You left nothing undone. I was glad you made her play so much, for having no instrument at her grandmother's, it must have been a real indulgence." "I am happy you approved," said Emma, smiling. "But I hope I am not often deficient in what is due to guests at Hartfield." "No, my dear," said her father instantly. "That I am sure you are not. There is nobody half so attentive and civil as you are. If anything, you are too attentive. The muffin last night, if it had been handed round once, I think it would have been enough." "No," said Mr. Knightley nearly at the same time, "you are not often deficient. Not often deficient either in manner or comprehension. I think you understand me, therefore." An arch look expressed, "I understand you well enough," but she said only, "Miss Fairfax is reserved." "I always told you she was, a little, but you will soon overcome all that part of her reserve which ought to be overcome, all that has its foundation in diffidence. What arises from discretion must be honoured. You think her diffident. I do not see it. My dear Emma, said he, moving from his chair into one close by her, you are not going to tell me, I hope, that you had not a pleasant evening? Oh, no. I was pleased with my own perseverance in asking questions, and amused to think how little information I obtained. I am disappointed, was his only answer. I hope everybody had a pleasant evening, said Mr. Woodhouse in his quiet way. I had. Once I felt the fire rather too much, but then I moved back my chair a very little, and it did not disturb me. Miss Bates was very chatty and good-humoured, as she always is, though she speaks rather too quick. However, she is very agreeable, and Mrs. Bates too, in a different way. I like old friends, and Miss Jane Fairfax is a very pretty sort of young lady, a very pretty and a very well-behaved young lady indeed. She must have found the evening agreeable, Mr. Knightley, because she had Emma. True, sir, and Emma because she had Miss Fairfax. Emma saw his anxiety, and wishing to appease it, at least for the present, said, and with a sincerity which no one could question, She is a sort of elegant creature that one cannot keep one's eyes from. I am always watching her to admire, and I do pity her from my heart. Mr. Knightley looked as if he were more gratified than he cared to express, and before he could make any reply, Mr. Woodhouse, whose thoughts were on the Bateses, said, It is a great pity that their circumstances should be so confined, a great pity indeed, and I have often wished, but it is so little one can venture to do, small trifling presents of anything uncommon. Now we have killed a porker, and Emma thinks of sending them a loin or a leg. It is very small and delicate. Hartfield pork is not like any other pork, but still it is pork, and, my dear Emma, unless one could be sure of their making it into steaks nicely fried, as ours are fried, without the smallest grease, and not roast it, for no stomach can bear roast pork, I think we had better send the leg. Do not you think so, my dear? My dear papa, I sent the whole hind quarter. I knew you would wish it. There will be the leg to be salted, you know, which is so very nice, and the loin to be dressed directly in any manner they like. That's right, my dear, very right. I had not thought of it before, but that is the best way. They must not over-salt the leg. And then, if it is not over-salted, and if it is very thoroughly boiled, just as Searle boils ours, and eaten very moderately of, with a boiled turnip and a little carrot or parsnip, I do not consider it unwholesome. Emma, said Mr. Knightley presently, I have a piece of news for you. You like news, and I heard an article in my way hither that I think will interest you. News? Oh, yes, I always like news. What is it? Why do you smile so? Where did you hear it? At Randall's? He had time only to say, No, not at Randall's. I have not been near Randall's, when the door was thrown open, and Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax walked into the room. Full of thanks and full of news, Miss Bates knew not which to give quickest. Mr. Knightley soon saw that he had lost his moment, and that not another syllable of communication could rest with him.
Oh, my dear sir, how are you this morning? My dear Miss Woodhouse, I am quite overpowered. Such a beautiful hind quarter of pork. You are too bountiful. Have you heard the news? Mr. Elton is going to be married.
Emma had not had time even to think of Mr. Elton, and she was so completely surprised that she could not avoid a little start, and a little blush at the sound. There is my news. I thought it would interest you, said Mr. Knightley, with a smile which implied a conviction of some part of what had passed between them.
But where could you hear it? cried Miss Bates. Where could you possibly hear it, Mr. Knightley? For it is not 5 minutes since I received Mrs. Cole's note. No, it cannot be more than 5, or at least 10, for I had got my bonnet and spencer on, just ready to come out. I was only gone down to speak to Patty again about the pork. Jane was standing in the passage. Were not you, Jane? For my mother was so afraid that we had not any salting-pan large enough. So I said I would go down and see, and Jane said, shall I go down instead? For I think you have a little cold, and Patty has been washing the kitchen. Oh, my dear, said I. Well, and just then came the note. A Miss Hawkins, that's all I know, a Miss Hawkins of Bath. But, Mr. Knightley, how could you possibly have heard it? For the very moment Mr. Cole told Mrs. Cole of it, she sat down and wrote to me, a Miss Hawkins.
I was with Mr. Cole on business an hour and a half ago. He had just read Elton's letter as I was shown in, and handed it to me directly.
Well, that is quite— I suppose there was never a piece of news more generally interesting. My dear sir, you really are too bountiful. My mother desires her very best compliments and regards, and 1,000 thanks, and says you really quite press her.
We consider our Hartfield pork, replied Mr. Woodhouse. Indeed, it certainly is so very superior to all other pork, that Emma and I cannot have a greater pleasure than—
Oh, my dear sir, as my mother says, our friends are only too good to us. If ever there were people who, without having great wealth themselves, had everything they could wish for, I am sure it is us. We may well say that our lot is cast in a goodly heritage. Well, Mr. Knightley, and so you actually saw the letter? Well!
It was short, merely to announce, but cheerful, exulting, of course. Here was a sly glance at Emma. He had been so fortunate as to—I forget the precise words, one has no business to remember them. The information was, as you state, that he was going to be married to a Miss Hawkins. By his style, I should imagine it just settled. Mr. Elton going to be married, said Emma as soon as she could speak. He will have everybody's wishes for his happiness. He is very young to settle, was Mr. Woodhouse's observation. He had better not be in a hurry. He seemed to me very well off as he was. We were always glad to see him at Hartfield.
A new neighbour for us all, Miss Woodhouse, said Miss Bates joyfully. My mother is so pleased. She says she cannot bear to have the poor old vicarage without a mistress. This is great news indeed. Jane, you have never seen Mr. Elton. No wonder that you have such a curiosity to see him.
Jane's curiosity did not appear of that absorbing nature as wholly to occupy her. No, I have never seen Mr. Elton, she replied, starting on this appeal. Is he a tall man? Who shall answer that question? Cried Emma. My father would say yes, Mr. Knightley no, and Miss Bates and I that he is just the happy medium. When you have been here a little longer, Miss Fairfax, you will understand that Mr. Elton is the standard of perfection in Highbury, both in person and mind.
Very true, Miss Woodhouse, so she will. He is the very best young man. But, my dear Jane, if you remember, I told you yesterday he was precisely the height of Mr. Perry. Miss Hawkins, I dare say an excellent young woman. His extreme attention to my mother, wanting her to sit in the vicarage pew that she might hear the better, for my mother is a little deaf, you know. It is not much, but she does not hear quite quick. Jane says that Colonel Campbell is a little deaf. He fancied bathing might be good for it, the warm bath, but she says it did him no lasting benefit. Colonel Campbell, you know, is quite our angel, and Mr. Dixon seems a very charming young man, quite worthy of him. It is such a happiness when good people get together, and they always do. Now here will be Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins, and there are the Coles, such very good people, and the Perrys. I suppose there never was a happier or a better couple than Mr. and Mrs. Perry. I say, sir, turning to Mr. Woodhouse, I think there are few places with such society as Highbury. I always say we are quite blessed in our neighbours. My dear sir, if there is one thing my mother loves better than another, it is pork, a roast loin of pork. As to who or what Miss Hawkins is, or how long he has been acquainted with her, said Emma, nothing, I suppose, can be known. One feels that it cannot be a very long acquaintance. He has been gone only 4 weeks. Nobody had any information to give, and after a few more wonderings, Emma said, You are silent, Miss Fairfax, but I hope you mean to take an interest in this news. You who have been hearing and seeing so much of late on these subjects, who must have been so deep in the business on Miss Campbell's account,
We shall not excuse your being indifferent about Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins." "When I have seen Mr. Elton," replied Jane, "I dare say I shall be interested, but I believe it requires that with me, and as it is some months since Miss Campbell married, the impression may be a little worn off."
"Yes, he has been gone just 4 weeks, as you observe, Miss Woodhouse," said Miss Bates. 4 weeks yesterday. A Miss Hawkins! Well, I had always rather fancied it would be some young lady hereabouts. Not that I ever— Mrs. Cole once whispered to me, but I immediately said, no, Mr. Elton is a most worthy young man, but— in short, I do not think I am particularly quick at those sorts of discoveries. I do not pretend to it. What is before me, I see. At the same time, nobody could wonder if Mr. Elton should have aspired— Oh, Miss Woodhouse lets me chatter on so good-humouredly. She knows I would not offend for the world. How does Miss Smith do? She seems quite recovered now. Have you heard from Mrs. John Knightley lately? Oh, those dear little children! Jane, do you know I always fancy Mr. Dixon quite like Mr. John Knightley. I mean in person, tall and with that sort of look, and not very talkative."
"Quite wrong, my dear aunt. There is no likeness at all."
"Very odd, but one never does form a just idea of anybody beforehand. One takes up a notion and runs away with it. Mr. Dixon, you say, is not, strictly speaking, handsome?"
"Handsome? Oh, no. Far from it. Certainly plain. I told you he was plain."
"My dear, you said that Miss Campbell would not allow him to be plain, and that you yourself—"
"Oh, as for me, my judgment is worth nothing. Where I have a regard, I always think a person well-looking. But I gave what I believed the general opinion when I called him plain."
"Well, my dear Jane, I believe we must be running away. The weather does not look well, and grandmamma will be uneasy. You are too obliging, my dear Miss Woodhouse, but we really must take leave. This has been a most agreeable piece of news indeed. I shall just go round by Mrs. Cole's, but I shall not stop 3 minutes. And Jane, you had better go home directly. I would not have you out in a shower. We think she is the better for Highbury already. Thank you, we do indeed. I shall not attempt calling on Mrs. Goddard, for I really do not think she cares for anything but boiled pork. When we dress the leg, it will be another thing. Good morning to you, my dear sir. Oh, Mr. Knightley is coming too. Well, that is so very— I am sure if Jane is tired, you'll be so kind as to give her your arm. Mr. Elton and Miss Hawkins, good morning to you."
Emma, alone with her father, had half her attention wanted by him while he lamented that young people would be in such a hurry to marry, and to marry strangers too, and the other half she could give to her own view of the subject. It was to herself an amusing and a very welcome piece of news, as proving that Mr. Elton could not have suffered long, but she was sorry for Harriet. Harriet must feel it, and all that she could hope was, by giving the first information herself, to save her from hearing it abruptly from others. It was now about the time that she was likely to call. If she were to meet Miss Bates in her way— and upon its beginning to rain, Emma was obliged to expect that the weather would be detaining her at Mrs. Goddard's, and that the intelligence would undoubtedly rush upon her without preparation. The shower was heavy, but short, and it had not been over 5 minutes, when in came Harriet, with just the heated, agitated look which hurrying thither with a full heart was likely to give, and the
"Oh, Miss Woodhouse, what do you think has happened?"
which instantly burst forth, had all the evidence of corresponding perturbation. As the blow was given, Emma felt that she could not show greater kindness than in listening, and Harriet, unchecked, ran eagerly through what she had to tell.
She had set out from Mrs. Goddard's half an hour ago. She had been afraid it would rain. She had been afraid it would pour down every moment. But she thought she might get to Hartfield first. She had hurried on as fast as possible. But then she was passing by the house where a young woman was making up a gown for her. She thought she would just step in and see how it went on. And though she did not seem to stay half a moment there, soon after she came out it began to rain, and she did not know what to do. So she ran on directly as fast as she could and took shelter at Ford's.
Ford's was the principal woollen-draper, linen-draper, and haberdasher's shop united, the shop first in size and fashion in the place.
And so there she had sat without an idea of anything in the world, full 10 minutes perhaps, when all of a sudden who should come in? To be sure it was so very odd, but they always dealt at Ford's. Who should come in but Elizabeth Martin and her brother? Dear Miss Woodhouse, only think! I thought I should have fainted. I did not know what to do. I was sitting near the door. Elizabeth saw me directly, but he did not. He was busy with the umbrella. I am sure she saw me, but she looked away directly and took no notice, and they both went to quite the farther end of the shop, and I kept sitting near the door. Oh dear, I was so miserable. I am sure I must have been as white as my gown. I could not go away, you know, because of the rain, but I did so wish myself anywhere in the world but there. Oh dear, Miss Woodhouse! Well, at last I fancy he looked round and saw me, for instead of going on with her buyings, they began whispering to one another. I am sure they were talking of me, and I could not help thinking that he was persuading her to speak to me. Do you think he was, Miss Woodhouse? For presently she came forward, came quite up to me and asked how I did, and seemed ready to shake hands if I would. She did not do any of it in the same way that she used. I could see that she was altered. But however she seemed to try to be quite friendly, and we shook hands, and stood talking some time. But I know no more what I said. I was in such a tremble, and I remember she said she was sorry we never met now, which I thought almost too kind. Dear Miss Woodhouse, I was absolutely miserable. By that time it was beginning to hold up, and I was determined that nothing should stop me from getting away, and then, only think, I found he was coming up towards me too, slowly, you know, and as if he did not quite know what to do, and so he came and spoke, and I answered, and I stood for a minute feeling dreadfully, you know, one can't tell how, and then I took courage and said it did not rain, and I must go, and so off I set, and I had not got 3 yards from the door when he came after me, only to say if I was going to Hartfield, he thought I had much better go round by Mr. Cole's stables, for I should find the near way quite floated by this rain. Oh dear, I thought it would have been the death of me. So I said I was very much obliged to him. You know I could not do less, and then he went back to Elizabeth, and I came round by the stables. I believe I did. But I hardly knew where I was or anything about it. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, I would rather done anything that have it happen, and yet you know there was a sort of satisfaction in seeing him behave so pleasantly and so kindly, and Elizabeth too. Oh, Miss Woodhouse, do talk to me and make me comfortable again.
Very sincerely did Emma wish to do so, but it was not immediately in her power. She was obliged to stop and think. She was not thoroughly comfortable herself. The young man's conduct and his sister's seemed the result of real feeling, and she could not but pity them. As Harriet described it, there had been an interesting mixture of wounded affection and genuine delicacy in their behaviour, but she had believed them to be well-meaning, worthy people before, and what difference did this make in the evils of the connection? It was folly to be disturbed by it. Of course he must be sorry to lose her, they must all be sorry. Ambition as well as love had probably been mortified. They might all have hoped to rise by Harriet's acquaintance, and besides, what was the value of Harriet's description? So easily pleased, so little discerning, what signified her praise? She exerted herself and did try to make her comfortable, by considering all that had passed as a mere trifle, and quite unworthy of being dwelt on. "It might be distressing for the moment," said she, "but you seem to have behaved extremely well, and it is over, and may never, can never, as a first meeting, occur again, and therefore you need not think about it." Harriet said, "Very true," and she "would not think about it," but still she talked of it, still she could talk of nothing else, and Emma at last, in order to put the Martins out of her head, was obliged to hurry on the news, which she had meant to give with so much tender caution, hardly knowing herself whether to rejoice or be angry, ashamed or only amused, at such a state of mind in poor Harriet, such a conclusion of Mr. Elton's importance with her. Mr. Elton's rights, however, gradually revived, though she did not feel the first intelligence as she might have done the day before, or an hour before, its interest soon increased, and before their first conversation was over she had talked herself into all the sensations of curiosity, wonder, and regret, pain and pleasure, as to this fortune at Miss Hawkins's, which could conduce to place the Martins under proper subordination in her fancy. Emma learned to be rather glad that there had been such a meeting. It had been serviceable in deadening the first shock, without retaining any influence to alarm. As Harriet now lived, the Martins could not get at her without seeking her, where hitherto they had wanted either the courage or the condescension to seek her. For since her refusal of the brother, the sisters never had been at Mrs. Goddard's, and a 12-month might pass without their being thrown together again, with any necessity, or even any power of speech. Chapter 3.
So back to the beginning of the Miss Bates chapter, the first chapter that we read today. I love the way that Jane Austen gets across the fact that everybody in Highbury thinks that Emma is just awesome, except Mr. Knightley. He's the only one who calls her on her stuff. And so she does have that voice in the back of her head. So when she's with Harriet and Harriet's kind of annoying her, she is able to, well, I really should go visit the Miss Bateses. So now's as good a time as any. Plus, it's not on a day when there will be a letter from Jane Fairfax. So this will be perfect. One of the comments that we got is in the last week or two regarded Emma's awareness of social class and the commentary of social class. And some of that I think is just natural. Everybody was aware of this in ways that we may be aware of it, but we don't talk about it this way. You will hear her say directly that the problem wasn't going and visiting the Bateses. They were socially at a level that it was perfectly fine for Emma to visit. But a lot of the people who visited them were second and third rate people in Highbury. And Emma may wind up in the drawing room with these other people. And that would be awkward. And it actually would kind of be awkward because she's, like we talked about before, she is very good about going and helping the actual poor, people who are living in poverty, who don't have access to whatever. Those people, even though Donwell Abbey is really the main focus of this area, even though that's true, Emma's still the one who goes out to help the poor. This is not that group of people. These are people who are well enough off to be able to go and visit, but not landed gentry. The Coles get mentioned early on in the chapters today. We're going to hear more about the Coles later, but the whole idea is the Coles will go to Bath. The Coles are up-and-comers. They're kind of nouveau riche, and they're friends of Mr. Elton. So that's just keep that in the back of your mind. I also loved that at one point, the way that Jane Austen describes how Miss Bates is picking up and dropping topics, it sounds like a horse race. It's like, and it's Biscuit by a head, and it's this one and coming out with a nose, and Mr. Elton's getting flung off, and now we get Jane Fairfax coming in. And it's just, I just love Miss Bates. Oh my God. There's a lot of real sly Austen humor. Thank you, you're so kind, replied the happily deceived aunt. Knife. Turn it. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the parts about Miss Bates that are annoying are but first of all, I really must, and well, you'll hear in the letter, which I'm about to read, or you'll get these details in the letter, which I'm going to start reading soon. And she never gets there, ever. She never actually starts reading the letter. But we know everything that was in it anyway, and that's fine. So we have to be sure as Harriet's tick. We have thank you, you are very kind. Seems to be Miss Bates's tick. So I told you to keep your ears open for stuff about Mr. Dixon. So the animating suspicion entering Emma's brain with regard to Jane Fairfax and this charming Mr. Dixon and her not going to Ireland. So in the middle of Miss Bates boring Emma picks up on this one idea and is like, ooh, I wonder if that's why. Well, now she has something interesting to think about. And that turns out to be both fun and incorrect. And it's not a scandal or anything, but it is interesting to get to see the inner workings of Emma's mind, kind of just like what she did with Elton and Harriet. Like she saw something that maybe could be kind of sort of, let's play that out and see how it goes. She's doing the same thing in her mind with Jane Fairfax. Mrs. Campbell talks about, when they're talking about health, they particularly wish her to try her native air. Along with miasma last week, native air in this situation was the belief that the air in the area that you were born in would be more conducive to your health. It was something that was more a part of you. And in some ways, that actually kind of doesn't sound completely stupid if the modern, they say research, but I've never actually gone to look this up. So somebody's going to correct me, I hope, if I'm way off or if they know that this is way off. But I've been hearing a lot of lately that if you're having trouble with allergies, one of the things you can do is get local honeybee honey, because that will have some of the pollen in it and it'll be like getting allergy shots, that you get your body used to the pollen so that it doesn't create histamines and make you itchy and miserable. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But it has to be the bees. It's not just any honey. It has to be the bees in your local area, because you're all part of that ecosystem, that air, that pollen, everything. I don't know. I just thought it was kind of interesting. And this is not the first point. We've had several already, places where they're referring to Jane Fairfax not being as well as she usually is. And in fact, one of the things that I wanted to let you know is in an annotation here, there's a kind of an oblique reference to the nephews who wound up, especially the nephew that wound up writing about Jane Austen, kept as many of her papers and letters as he could. And there were lots of conversations that they had when she was living. And one of the things that she was known for in her family was she would write these novels, and the novel has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Ta-da! But Jane had all of their pre-story and all of their post-story stories in her head. And she said in writing, Jane Fairfax survived her elevation, so she's going to have a decent end at the end of this book. But she survived it only 9 or 10 years. So she really is not very healthy. This is not, oh, this is something's really up. So Jane is kind of a parallel for Frank Churchill, that the Campbells wound up bringing her up. She belonged to them. She's raised in their home, and they're going to do everything they can for her, but she isn't going to inherit any money from them the way that their own daughter does. And that leaves her with one job, which is being a governess, that she does not seem to be cut out to be. And she sure doesn't seem to be very excited about it. Honest to God, she doesn't seem to be very excited about anything. The description of a governess having to retire from all the pleasures of life, of rational intercourse, equal society, peace and hope, penance and mortification forever. And I wrote in my notes, that's not hyperbole. That's just the way it was. Woof. You may have also noticed that the parts of the discussion about Mr. Knightley talking to Emma about Jane Fairfax in our second chapter today, and then the scene that's alluded to in chapter 3, but that's not really a scene, those get smashed together in the movie versions, most of the movie versions, and it's bigger. There's more going on in there, that we see Emma playing the piano and singing okay, and then Jane Fairfax sits down and just knocks it out of the park. So it's one of those things that we have to hear about here as this happened, but that can be shown instead of told in the movie versions, which is pleasant. But sometimes in some of the versions of the movie, they make it a little bit more heavy-handed, almost slapsticky. And I don't think it's supposed to be. I don't think anybody's lying about Emma being good. It's just that she's good. She's fine. Jane is gifted, and there's difference. So Jane and Emma were both 19 when they first met. They really haven't known each other. They didn't grow up together or being in each other's worlds. It's only been recently that they've met. And I don't know about you guys, but honestly, here's the thing. Emma is deeply flawed. Many of us are at that age. You think you understand everything and that you know how everything should work, and that's great, but you really haven't lived very long, and you really haven't seen a whole lot of things happen. And as a consequence, you're going to make some pretty massive mistakes. That's how you gain wisdom. Emma is in that puppy dog phase where she's just kind of excited, and she's very good at talking and keeping conversations going and being charming. And she tries to have these conversations with Jane Fairfax, who is just like, yes, no, thank you. It's time to go. And that's it. I would really have a hard time with Jane Fairfax. She would make me so uncomfortable. Oh man. Yes. I love that the Emma was obliged to play piano, and the thanks and praise which necessarily followed appeared to her, meaning Emma noticed that it was an affectation of candor, an air of greatness. People were being nice, but it was all fake praise, because when Jane started playing, the reality was right there. And then there was no getting at Jane's real opinion. Wrapped up in a cloak of politeness, she seemed determined to hazard nothing. She was suspiciously reserved. Who puts those words together? Only Jane Austen. Disgustingly and suspiciously reserved. Oh my God, I love it. We are putting the picture of the Gutenberg page so that you can see all of the punctuation for the part where Emma's trying to pump Jane for information about Frank Churchill. Was he handsome? She believed he was reckoned to be a very fine young man. Was he agreeable? He was generally thought so. It's the yes, no, thank you, the end. She has no there, Jane Fairfax does. And the end of that chapter 2, volume 2, is Emma could not forgive her for not being more talkative and forthcoming with answers to her questions. Emma could not forgive her, period. Turn the page. Emma could not forgive her, but as neither provocation nor and it goes on. It repeats the end of that paragraph as the beginning of this one, and then continues the sentence. It's beautifully dovetailed together. And then, of course, Mr. Woodhouse has to go back to the pork, because if it isn't about food, it isn't worth reading. And in more of the, wow, Jane Fairfax is really boring part, Mr. Elton comes up and she's expected to have some kind of a response to the fact of him. And she says, no, I've never seen him. Is he M dash? Is he a tall man? And Emma just blows up like, wow, who's going to answer that question? That is not a useful question, because he's going to say he's short. I'm going to say he's tall. And Emma just has had it with all of this, and she can't hide it anymore. The other thing that could not be hidden was Miss Bates clearly thought that Elton was after Emma, and possibly vice versa, because her paragraph, again, with the M dashes and the commas and the pauses, is just amazing. A Miss Hawkins, so she's talking about his actual wife, M dash. Well, I had always rather fancied it could be some young lady hereabouts. Not that I ever, cutting off, M dash. Mrs. Cole once whispered to me, cutting off again, M dash, without having said anything. But immediately I said, no, Mr. Elton is a most worthy young man, but M dash. In short, no, I don't think I'm particularly quick at these sort of discoveries. So she has been backpedaling, like she goes so fast into it, realizes who she's talking to, and then has to kind of backpedal out. And it's some fancy footwork there that she does. And then she says, but Miss Woodhouse lets me chatter on so good-humoredly. She knows I would not offend for the world. And that gets said more than once. And then the other place where I just thought, yeah, I wouldn't like Jane Fairfax either. My dear, you said that Miss Campbell would not allow him to be plain, and that you thought yourself, talking about Mr. Dixon, oh, as for me, my judgment is worth nothing. Wow. I mean, is it virtue signaling or is it just diffidence? We don't know, because she doesn't give us enough to go on. She's not giving Emma enough to go on. And woof, just woof. And Mr. Woodhouse, oh, and people get married and they marry strangers. It's so sad. Oy. And then Harriet and Mr. Martin and Mr. Martin's sister. And it's just so sad. And then at the end of that part where Harriet is telling her whole story, oh, Miss Woodhouse, do talk to me and make me comfortable again. Which I thought was an interesting way to say it. It's not lie to me or tell me stories. It's make me feel comfortable. And I started thinking, it really would be. Emma is uniquely positive as a character. She's not cynical. And so, yeah, I imagine it would make you feel more comfortable to be around her because she makes it easy to chit chat and have a good time and enjoy yourself. She's also deeply annoying. And that is the thing about Emma. All right, I'm going to let you go. You have a great one. I will talk to you next week and take care of yourself. Have a great one. Bye. If you like what we do here, please consider liking and subscribing on iTunes, thumbs upping and subscribing on YouTube. You can visit patreon.com/craftlit and become a patron of this art. And you can always go to Linktree, linktr.ee/craftlit channel. And from there, you can get links out to all of the social media, all of the places that CraftLit lives. It's a nice hub that you can go to get all the stuff, all the good stuff. And I keep forgetting to mention, we also have a Facebook group with the loveliest group of people, as you might imagine. They're just awesome, makers and readers, and people who hadn't been readers before, but are now. I like that. All right. You take care of yourself. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon.